It's been a day of workers downing tools in all of Israel in compliance with the call for a day of general strike in a bid to pressure the government to secure the return of the remaining hostages still in Hamas captivity in the Gaza Strip. Israel's largest labor union, Histadrut, called a 24-hour general strike over the government's ongoing failure to agree a ceasefire deal and secure the hostages' return. Protesters gathered on the road with Israeli flags and banners in Tel Aviv, while traffic, including several buses, minibuses and other vehicles, came to a standstill. A pile of scooters laid on the road to block it. Earlier today, U.S. President Joe Biden reportedly said a deal is very close, but criticized the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for not doing enough. In the meantime, Israel's labor court has ordered an end to the strike at 2:30 p.m. local time. Businesses, schools and transport have been affected by the one-day strike, which was called by Histadrut, one of the country's most powerful unions. Some flights at Ben Gurion Airport, Israel's main air transit hub, have been disrupted, while protesters have blocked several roads. Earlier today, a funeral service in Jerusalem was held for one of the hostages whose body was recovered by Israel in Gaza. Hirsch Goldberg Polin, an American citizen, was attending the Supernova Music Festival on October 7 when Hamas-led gunmen from Gaza stormed Israel's border fence. Now, during the attack, he sought refuge in a bomb shelter with several dozen others, but gunmen gathered outside and began to throw grenades and was then taken hostage. He's one of 6 hostage bodies recovered by the Israeli Defense Forces on Saturday in an underground tunnel in the Rafah area of southern Gaza. The news angered Israelis, who called for nationwide protests against the government. Israelis criticized the current hostage negotiations with Hamas in Qatar. The protests are taking place in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, with plans for a general strike on Monday. Protesters want the government to reach a deal with Hamas to release those held in Gaza. It comes as the Israeli Health Ministry said close-range gunshots killed 6 hostages whose bodies were recovered in the Gaza Strip. The bodies were located on Saturday in an underground tunnel in the Rafah area of southern Gaza. They were named as Carmel Gat, Eden Yerushalmi, Hirsch Goldberg Polin, Alexander Lobanov, Almog Sarusi, and Master Sergeant Ori Danino. Spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said they were brutally murdered by Hamas terrorists shortly before the IDF reached them. A senior Hamas official, Izzat al-Rishk, insisted Israel was responsible for their deaths, as it has refused to sign a ceasefire deal. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accused Hamas of killing the 6 hostages. He said in a video address on Sunday that whoever murders abductees does not want a deal, referring to the negotiations with Hamas over a possible ceasefire.
בגיבוי מלא של ארצות הברית. החמאס סירב. גם אחרי שארצות הברית עדכנה את מתווה העסקה ב-16 באוגוסט.
Israeli intermediaries returned from Cairo last week, following the latest round of negotiations to secure a hostage release and ceasefire deal in the Gaza Strip. Hamas has reportedly rejected the Israeli proposal, which would see it maintain checkpoints in the Philadelphia corridor and Netzarim border crossing. In another development, the United Nations has officially launched a vaccination campaign against polio in central Gaza. The vaccination, which began on Sunday, is expected to continue until Wednesday as the program targets more than 600,000 children in the besieged Strip. This comes as health officials confirmed Gaza's first polio cases in 25 years earlier this month. It was discovered in an unvaccinated 10-month-old child.
We are here in Deir al-Balah. The United Nations vaccination campaign for polio has begun. As you can see behind me, there are already hundreds of people here, hundreds of families and children ready to get their vaccination. UNRWA is here with the World Health Organization and UNICEF. This is an UNRWA health center, and our staff are here ready to give the vaccination to as many children as possible over the next 3 days in this first phase of the vaccination campaign. So far, everything is going to plan. The children are arriving, the families are here, the vaccinations are going well. We have the vaccinations in individual cool boxes to sustain the heat of the day. It seems calm and quiet in the Gaza Strip so far. The humanitarian pause is so far lasting, which is what we need to implement this vaccine campaign, and we will see how things go over the coming days.
The VOA's Linda Gradstein is in Jerusalem. She joins us now. Linda, great to see you. How far-reaching are these protests in Israel?
Well, these are the first really large protests since the war began almost 11 months ago. There was a sense that during a war, when you had, this fighting both in Gaza and on the border with Lebanon, that was not the time to protest. But it reminds me of the large protests that we saw against the judicial overhaul, which Netanyahu was trying to push through before the war. And those protests of hundreds of thousands of people week after week eventually did lead to Israel the government having to back down and not do this judicial overhaul that it was trying to do. So there's a sense that this is that time. It also reminds me of in March when Netanyahu tried to fire the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who's very popular. There were 300,000 people out on the streets, and he retracted his decision. So again, it remains to be seen if this is going to continue for the next few days and weeks, or if it's going to be a one-off thing. But there is a sense that something has changed, that after almost a year of war, that people just want a ceasefire. They want the hostages back. And what's especially tragic about the case of these 6 hostages, one of whom, as you mentioned earlier, was buried today. He's an Israeli American. I actually know his parents. He grew up with one of my sons, is that they were shot just 48 to 72 hours before they were found, meaning that if the ceasefire deal had gone through as had been hoped for, they would have been returned to Israel alive.
And indeed, and I know that the Israeli government, I don't know if they have taken responsibility for this. The 6 hostages who were recovered, the Prime Minister condemned their murders, but of what comfort is this, after they have died, and then knowing that if the deal had been signed just a few hours before, these people could have been alive today?
Well, many of the hostage families blame the government and say that Netanyahu especially has been kind of dragging his feet, has been adding new conditions to make any deal impossible. And at the same time, it seems that the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, does also not want a deal. So the two of them are kind of collaborating in there not being a deal. For example, you spoke in the report earlier about the Philadelphia corridor and Israel insisting on maintaining a presence in the Philadelphia corridor. That is a relatively new demand from Israel's side. That was not in the original agreement or the original proposal that the United States, that President Biden talked about in May. So the hostage families and many Israelis blame this government for putting new conditions on that have made a deal much more difficult. And with these 6, somehow it's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. You're seeing these large demonstrations. You're seeing a tremendous amount of anger and sadness. The funeral today for Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, there were thousands and thousands of people who came to the funeral, and his parents, Rachel and John, spoke incredibly movingly about their son and about the future. The president of the state of Israel, Isaac Herzog, it's mostly a ceremonial position, said that he was sorry that Israel has failed Hirsch and the other hostages, but we did not hear that from Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Right, and I can imagine how heartbreaking this is, not just for the families, but even those who knew the hostages having to say goodbye without having seen them to really say goodbye. Let's talk about the families. Are they also participating in the protests, or they're just mourning in silence and in seclusion?
I think, it depends. Rachel and John have, until Hirsch was found, been campaigning tirelessly for the release of the hostages and for a ceasefire deal. Now, the funeral was just a few hours ago. I think the families of the hostages, in some cases, it's the parents of the hostages who are speaking out and saying there has to be a deal now. And other times, it's more distant relatives, uncles, cousins, things like that. So I think it just really depends on the situation. And I think it's worth saying that there is a group of hostage families who are supporting the prime minister and his position that only military pressure will lead to the release of the hostages, and encouraging him to continue with his campaign in Gaza. So the truth is the hostage families are split.
And how much intervention has the government made into the protests? I know the courts did order earlier on for an end to the protests, but has the government intervened in any way?
Well, the end was to the general strike, not to the actual protests on the street. In other words, the labor court said that it was a political protest and people had to go back to work. As you said earlier in your report, the airport was shut down for a few hours. Some things were closed, some things were open. It was really some cities were, had public transportation, some didn't. It was a kind of a mix of things. But what we're looking at now, these large-scale protests, especially in Tel Aviv, that the government has not tried to stop. However, often what happens at the end of the protests, a small group blocks the highway, and that happened yesterday. It happened again today, and then the police does move in to, to clear the roads, and in some cases to arrest those demonstrators. So it's legal to hold demonstrations. The government is not stopping that, but once it moves to illegal activity like blocking roads, then the police do move in. So the government did stop the strike, the one-day labor strike, but you saw large protests in Israel yesterday and today, and the sense I get is that we're going to see more of these large protests in the coming weeks.
Yes, we understand the demonstrations, or the demonstrators intend to be on the streets up until Wednesday. Just wondering, after today's protest, the strike, which has ended, did people go back to work?
Some people went back to work. The truth is that the strike ended at 2:30 in the afternoon, which is pretty close to the end of the workday. So I think not that many people came. And I think that some companies, a lot of private companies, had said that if their workers want to go to the protest, they gave them permission to do that, or people could just take a day off and decide to continue to protest. So there is a sense, separately, by the way, high schools are also striking, not connected to this, connected to pay raises for teachers. So which is something that does happen quite frequently at the beginning of the school year. So while some people went back to work, and the airport certainly had already actually opened up, but you still do have large numbers of people on the streets. Israel's a small country. The population is just over 9 million. And for example, just like I know one of the hostage families, almost everybody in Israel knows one of the hostage families. So, it's all very personal for people, and there definitely is a sense that the protest movement is re-energized in a way that it hasn't been since the war with Hamas, since Hamas started the war on October 7th.
Linda, thanks again for speaking with us, and do stay safe. Our condolences to you and others who are mourning at this time.
Thank you.